great week in Bitcoin too. We've got some big news. I think maybe the biggest news, arguably, of the week is this Bitcoin being used or allowed to be considered when applying for a mortgage. So the FHFA is reportedly instructing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to treat Bitcoin as an asset in mortgage considerations. So this is obviously a massive shift. In fact, Corey Clipston told me that he was actually denied a mortgage request a few years ago because he had so much of his assets in Bitcoin that were not allowed to be considered. So he was interviewed on Blockworks. I need to check and see if that article dropped, but it does happen, guys. It does happen to Bitcoiners. So this is interesting and big news. I'd love to hear you guys' take on it. Let's start with you, Stephen.
Yeah, totally. So I think something I noticed online is people don't, it's not always immediately apparent what this news means or what it would mean if fully implemented. So maybe I'll start just by explaining that. So when you go for a mortgage, there's two things that they're checking. They're checking your income, and they're also checking kind of your net worth, your assets and your holdings. And so what happened previously is they would not, generally speaking, I don't think this was 100% of the time, but generally speaking, they would not count Bitcoin holdings. So if you had Bitcoin, they just wouldn't count that towards your net worth calculation. And so sometimes that could be a problem because it's like your net worth wasn't high enough for them to feel comfortable giving you the loan that you want. So this is different than like you're taking the mortgage against the Bitcoin, or the Bitcoin is collateral, or you have to give them the Bitcoin or sell the Bitcoin or whatever. The Bitcoin is not involved in the financial transaction in any way. It's just how they calculate who they want to lend to. And so this opens it up so Bitcoiners are not unfairly punished for that being how they choose to store their wealth. It makes getting loans easier. So a really cool development. And I think just further evidence of Bitcoin becoming just so much more widely integrated into the financial system and coming to really have its own place in our economic environment.
Yeah, piggybacking off on that, I think the most important thing here is that Pulte tweeted it, saw a response saying, hey, why don't you add Bitcoin to this? 24 hours later, there's movement.
Yes.
Right, that's incredible.
Absolutely.
Not committees, not 6 months later, not next legislative cycle, none of that. Just tweet here, boom, we're moving.
So can I go apply for a mortgage now and have my Bitcoin be considered as an asset?
I don't know if it'll be that immediate. I mean, maybe I can offer a bunch of thoughts here. Before I do that, I have to throw this up. I almost put it on, but I didn't want to take off the sweater. My hair's it's in place right now. I couldn't risk taking off the sweater and putting on a different shirt. But this is the shirt that I was wearing in Miami Beach New Year's Eve with this crew of 4. So it's right here.
Yeah, this day right here.
Look at that. That's the photo evidence.
Yeah, we made that. We made that ship for Sailor. Put it together.
Yeah. That's a great.
It was a nice New Year's gift.
Yeah, Swan ship. That was something, right?
The
That was
Swan
great.
ship.
That was a great party.
An old wooden ship used in the Civil War era.
It's a good boat.
Great reference.
Cool boat, strong boat. Never seen a boat like that.
Civil War was, most people don't know this, but the Civil War was actually fought over paper Bitcoin. States' rights.
We'll come back to that one. Yeah, I have definitely some thoughts on this one. Also, just throwing it out there, as we said, Stephen was at BPI. We have to add to our agenda. Stephen, you got to give us from that event. But on mortgage stuff. So firstly, definitely a big deal. Bitcoin is getting treated more as an asset that, the traditional financial assets are getting treated. But I think there's some other things to keep in mind here. So firstly, I'm not going to claim that I have like a totally comprehensive view here, but I did run this by a friend of mine who's been a mortgage broker for like a couple of decades at some of the big shops out there. So like Stephen was saying, it is not the first thing that they're going to look at is how many assets you have. First, they're going to look at your credit score, your income, your debt to income ratio. What is your job, your employment history? They're going to care a lot more about those than what is the pile of assets that you have. They do care about assets for something. I think they call it cash reserves. So after you make your down payment, they're going to want to see something. Every bank's going to be a little different, but call it like 6 to 12 months of cash reserves to be able for, not even cash, could be in a liquid asset, for you to be able to pay. If you lost your job the day after getting the mortgage, they want you to have some cash to be able to make those payments. That doesn't, if you have a big pile of Bitcoin right now, it would only matter for those cash reserves. It's not going to help you if you have a bad credit score, no income, bad debt to income, and a bad employment history. So that you have to put that out there. What would really be a game changer is if Bitcoin can be counted as income. And you might sound like I misspoke there. How would an asset count as income? But that is the case. It's called asset dissipation. So you can have an asset that if it's big enough, you basically say, hey, if I were to sell this asset down over my 30-year mortgage period, then the issuing bank would say, yeah, sure, we'll count this as a form of income. If it's a stock that gives you dividends, they'll kind of count that as well. That would be pretty big for Bitcoiners who have a big pile of Bitcoin and it gets counted as, I think they call it imputed income. They translate it to income. As far as I know, there's no discussion of Bitcoin being treated as that for now. So I'm throwing some cold water on this. I don't think it's like immediately relevant for Bitcoiners who are going to go get a mortgage soon. And then lastly, there's this whole other element of like, all right, fine. Even if they're counting Bitcoin in some way, are they counting your Bitcoin in cold storage? The answer is almost certainly not. Just like if you had $10 million of gold bars in your basement, they're not really going to count that. So it's probably going to have to be in some form of third-party custody. Maybe there's some future world where you can prove to them that you have self-custody of Bitcoin and they'll count it. But I think that's a long, long time away. So glad that it's happening. We're going in the right direction, but there's a lot of other nuances to consider here.
And here's real quick, I want to answer this question, Stephen. So this is not a requirement for banks, for private banks. It has been directed for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and it has also opened up doing this as an option for private banks. So it's not required for private banks. Just to clarify.
So one detail. So the way I think this will work for self-custody is that if you want the Bitcoin to be counted, you move it like to Coinbase. You demonstrate that it's in Coinbase and you can take it out after, would be my assumption. I think you just need to know they're not going to recognize it in a wallet, but because of the nature of Bitcoin, unlike gold bars, you can move it to a custodian, get a snapshot, and then take it out, would be my guess.
I think there's a good chance of that. And related to this whole discussion, also the question that we just showed at the bottom there, a friend of mine who's a mortgage broker, I asked him the question of how much of this is in your power versus how much is in FHFA. And his response was basically, I won't say the name of the firm he works for, but XYZ firm that I work for will do whatever the FHFA says. Yeah. So if they kind of issue guidance and says, hey, you should do this, the banks will do it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Well, just another kind of notch in the, I guess, step in the ladder on up to, legitimizing Bitcoin as an asset in the financial system. All right, everyone, check out swan.com/private. That's the business that Stephen helped build up and led, and John is a managing director there as well. So check out swan.com/private. Check out btcandDC.com. Again, we mentioned it earlier. There's going to be some cool stuff happening in DC September 30th, October 1st, that week with PubKey and with the conference BTC and DC. Also, shout out to Mara. Thanks for securing the Bitcoin network. Thank you for supporting the show, and thank you for owning a ton of Bitcoin. Great job. Congratulations. All right, everyone. Take care. We're out.